Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum's Curator Conversations, our first one of the month of March. And today we are looking at the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Before we get started, I just want to say hello, my name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist here, and I'll be just kind of taking everybody through the first few moments of this. But before we get started, I would just like to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in providing all this free programming that the museum gets to offer while we are under lockdown, pandemic, whatever you like to call it. The foundation does a fantastic job in supporting us, not only for these curator conversations that we do, but also for our trivia nights, our drink and draws, our movie discussions, just so much programming that we get to put out there virtually. And we would not be able to do it without the foundation's support or the support of their executive director, Ms. Jennifer Carlson. So thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for allowing us to do all this and giving us all this great support that just really allows us to reach out, not only nationally, but we also have an international audience now. So that's just fantastic that we get to do all these things, and then we get the great support from the foundation like we do. Like I said, today we're going to be talking about the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. We're going to be looking at some of the strategic elements of it, but also some of the Wisconsin stories that have come out of that particular event as well. Mr. Kevin Hampton, our curator of history, is going to be taking us through today, along with our museum director, Mr. Chris Kolakowski. So what I'm going to do right now is turn it over to them and let them get going. And thanks again, everybody, for showing up today and for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Eric. We appreciate it immensely. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're happy to have everyone here for part of the conversation. As those of you who have joined us before, you know that we take this time to really just have a conversation about history, because that's what history is. It's meant to be stories that are shared. Those of you that also know that I personally have a fond, I guess I'd say I prefer alliteration. So we're doing strategies and stories today with the Museum Men with Maps. We're going to try and fit in as much alliteration as possible into these programs, so we're just leaning into it at this point.
By the way, the Men with Maps was given to us by other members of the staff. Kevin did not come up with that on his own.
No. That's not my personal nickname. I don't know. But anyway, so we're happy to have you all here. And actually, we're also extremely happy to be joined, of course, by Eric, who happens to be a Gulf War veteran himself. He'll be actually joining us throughout the conversation to tell us, perhaps to weigh in on some commentary, if not some heckling, to see if we get things right or wrong. But really, I do want to point that out because he'll be a valuable voice here in the conversation today. So today we're of course talking about the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. In particular, we're going to focus on the stories and the strategy behind Operation Desert Storm. As everyone knows, I'm sure, we're wrapping up the 30th anniversary series. In theory, the ceasefire was yesterday. The anniversary of the ceasefire was yesterday on the 28th of February, after 100 hours of ground combat and 42 days of aerial combat or aerial strikes. And realistically, though, we're doing this on March 1st because, as we'll talk about, the fighting doesn't actually truly end on the 28th. There is some time that actually goes beyond that, several days, if not almost a week or even longer afterwards, that there's still actual fighting going on. So even though historically we like to celebrate or commemorate, the anniversary is the 24th of February through the 28th of February, it really realistically goes well beyond that. Also, as everyone knows who's joining us, you know, at Wisconsin Veterans Museum, we believe in three guiding interpretive principles. Every veteran is a story, Wisconsin was there, and why it still matters. And I hope that throughout our conversation today, you're going to see us pointing out those three things, because that's really, truly what we believe in what we tell, how we tell our stories, what we tell, and what we stand for as an institution. So with that, we'll get right into it. And Chris, I'm hoping you can join me here in the beginning. We're going to talk a little bit about what we're facing if you're looking at the beginning of talking about Operation Desert Storm. Obviously, Iraq invaded Kuwait in August, which we know in 1990, and trigger of events, 5 days later, the first U.S. troops deploy. But let's talk a little bit about the context even beyond that. Let's talk about the global context, if we could, thinking about the fact that this is really the last years of the Cold War, if you can think of it that way. This is a grander global conversation, right?
I would say it's actually the last months of the Cold War, because depending on how you score the end of the Cold War, I score the end of the Cold War being the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. And so the global backdrop of all of this, there's a lot of global uncertainty that is starting to happen. The stasis, if you will, the relative stasis or the relative definition to the world that had been given by the Cold War is fracturing. You've already had 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Many of the liberation, pro-democracy movements in Eastern Europe that have liberated many countries from communist rule. Germany is about to reunite. And this actually is a very important factor as we get to deploying forces from Germany to the Middle East. German reunification happens in October of 1990. So that process is going on, and it's something that there's a lot of stasis, and Soviet forces don't actually leave the former East Germany until 1994. Mm-hmm. So there's that element. The Soviet Union is playing very much a weakening hand. And as a matter of fact, by, as I mentioned, December 1991, Christmas 1991, they will go out of existence. The Soviet Union will go out of existence. So it's within this churn of the world that is going on in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the imminent demise of the Warsaw Pact, that other parts of the world begin to also become more fluid. And within that opportunity comes what Saddam Hussein sees as an opening to first try and pressure the Kuwaitis and then ultimately decide to invade and occupy Kuwait.
Well, and even with regional context, you're looking at the Iran and Iraq war, the Iraq-Iran war, whichever one you put it first, which has been raging essentially throughout the entire 80s. The decade of the 80s is the Iran-Iraq war.
Yeah, 1980 to 1988, that's right.
And, at this point, especially in 1990, the Iraqi army is massive. It is the fourth largest army in the world. And that's no small feat, but it's a direct byproduct of the Iran-Iraq war. And how they fought the Iran-Iraq war is very World War I, right?
Very much. Trench lines, mass attacks on both sides. It's a very, the battle lines don't move very far. They move a lot in 80 and 81, but by 82, when the Iranians really start to push the Iraqis and force them back basically along the Iran-Iraq border in those mountains and then along the coastal plain down by Basra, from that point on, it has far more in common, you're right, with World War I on the Western Front than it does anything else. The war, and this is one of the big reasons why Saddam feels the pressure to move, is because he had been paying for the war on his credit card, and the bankers included the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and a couple other Arab nations, and they were calling the bills due in 89 and 90. And the Iraqi economy was strained. The country was essentially not quite bankrupt, but it was certainly within visible sight of bankruptcy. Mm. And Saddam is being pushed into a corner. And then with that in mind, then you add the fall of the wall and that initial context that we talked about. He sees an opportunity to conceivably strike and take the emirate of Kuwait, which he's always believed and has always claimed, he and his party have always claimed was a part of Iraq anyway to begin with.
Right. And a lot of that combat in the Iran-Iraq war is happening right along this plain, like you were talking about.
Right.
The southeastern border of Iraq. So it's almost, it's just across the river, frankly, from Kuwait. So it's also not an area that Iraq isn't unfamiliar with fighting in, with the Iran incursions actually just across the border.
To put a fine point on that, if you look at the very southeastern tip of Iraq, you see the town of Al-Faw.
Yeah.
The Al-Faw Peninsula was fought back and forth for years. Both sides, horrific losses between the Iranians and the Iraqis. And the two villages above there, I'm not going to try and butcher their names. I think it's Khorramshahr and Abadan, were major battlefields from the very first days of the war
Exactly.
between Iran and Iraq. So that's very blood-soaked ground even before we get to 1991.
Right. And if we're looking at the context of the region too, I want to point out, as any a good military historian knows, maps are key because they tell a lot just in seeing what the terrain looks like. Unfortunately, we don't have a topographical map for this one, but you can actually see the highways and how they navigate through the area, what connects to what, and that's going to be very important in terms of the conversation that we're going to have here about the strategy behind Desert Storm in particular. But I want to point out, obviously, this region here, very few roads, as we can see. There's a couple different what will become supply depots for the Iraq Army. But really, it's very open. It's desolate. It's actually a very open desert, hard to navigate without being able to do so with current equipment that we have, and of course the brand new equipment that the American Army will roll out. But if you're looking here, the main arteries, if you will, is this one highway. I think it's Highway 80 out of Kuwait and into Kuwait, and then of course Highway 8 right along here in the river valley, straight up to Baghdad here. So just keep this in mind as we talk. Obviously, just across the border too, you've got, again, that same road situation. You've got I think it's the tap line road that runs along here, and then of course the one main highway into Kuwait right along this actual essentially riverbed. It's not a river every part of the year, but it's a main thoroughfare, and that's going to play a key role into the decision of what to defend on the Iraqi side, but also what to stage and make it look like the main assault for the American and coalition side. All right, so by January, obviously from August through January, there's this massive buildup happening. In the terms of numbers alone, you have almost 1 million coalition troops. It's the largest international coalition since World War II. Of all those troops, about 2/3 are American that have contributed to this, but there's actually almost every continent. I think actually every continent was represented in some capacity.
Except Antarctica.
Except for Antarctica, yes. The Penguins didn't make it. I don't know why. But yes, except for Antarctica, almost every continent is represented. And I think that speaks a lot to this initiative too, because there's UN backing behind it, obviously the UN resolutions that pass, and the deadlines in particular. And of course, the UN resolution that's passed again in December puts a deadline of January 14th, well, 15th, but 14th. And that's really the beginning of what we would call Operation Desert Storm, right?
Correct.
Excellent. Now, in that process, I just want to mention a couple things. Wisconsin was part of this. Wisconsin was there, and in no small numbers. This is the largest deployment for the Wisconsin National Guard and reserve units stationed in Wisconsin in 30 years up to that point. Wisconsin National Guard really didn't mobilize to this scale except for since the Berlin crisis in the 60s. And actually, I think the reserve didn't mobilize to this scale since Korea. So there's this massive mobilization. Over 10,000 Wisconsinites end up serving during this time period. They're from all over the place. These units come from Milwaukee, they come from Green Bay, they come from really almost every corner of the state, and they come from almost every branch. You've got Milwaukee Port Security Unit out of for the Coast Guard. You've got the Marine Reserve Unit out of Madison. You've got the 13th EVAC Hospital. You've got troops out of the Ordnance Company out of Appleton, and so on and so forth. If you're interested in knowing all the units that were mobilized from Wisconsin, feel free to check out our blog. We did a blog post about this, setting up the stage for our anniversary conversations, and we have them all listed there. But I want to point out that over the course of this really 5-month buildup, 6-month buildup almost, Wisconsin troops are arriving throughout this time period. And one of the first groups to arrive in October. of 1990, and it's actually the one of the transportation detachments out of Madison. And it's Leslie Ackberg actually describes, she's writing home at this time, and she's only been there for a little over a week. So she writes into the, I think it's the Stripes magazine, and she says that this place is not too bad now that we've been here for 8 days. The temperature is falling a little now, because remember, this is October in the desert. It has only been getting up to 100 degrees during the day, but down to 75 at night. Not too bad considering the day we arrived, it was 120 degrees. And you think about that, and she goes on to explain, to give you a visual of what that was like. She says, imagine sitting inside an oven set on high, sifting flour in front of a fan, and add in a few thousand flies. And so that kind of gives you an idea of that environment that they're waiting in and that they're staging in. And of course, by January, it's not actually that hot. It's the winter in the desert, and it's actually one of the wettest winters in the desert. Actually, I think I read somewhere that it was the wettest winter in 20 years for the Saudi Arabian desert. And I got a couple photos here just to illustrate that, just to see it. I'll share this one here. And these photos all come from our collection. But you can see, and it's never like a downpour of rain as far as I've understood it from the accounts that we've read. It's more of a consistent drizzle or consistent light rain. But the fact that this area doesn't receive that much rain and did receive that much rain in this small course of time really speaks to that impact the weather will have. And as we flip through here, we're going to flip through a couple. There's another one. This one.
One of the things, if I could just real quick,
yeah.
You were talking about the desert earlier, and I just want to, it brings home something that people, when they think about the desert, may not fully realize, is when you look at these pictures as you're cycling through them, the void, it's a sandy void. It's very flat. There are terrain undulations here and there. But warfare in the desert, and I remember reading this about the North Africa campaign between Rommel and the British. This is a perfect illustration. It resembles war at sea more than it actually resembles any other type of war on land.
That's a good analogy.
It's a very relatively flat, sandy void, which adds weight to other elements like firepower, being able to find people. And it's not a lot of places you can hide. You know, there are little hillocks here and there, but by and large, there's not like a ridge or a forest or anything like that. And so when you think about desert warfare and you try and visualize in your head like a tank division or a tank battalion moving, imagine a fleet at sea.
Oh, yeah.
And that gives you an idea of what this would have been like to some degree, or at least give you some sense of. They always said that's one of the problems that some of the senior leaders on both sides of World War II had, was not being able to visualize desert warfare, because It's unlike any other type of warfare fought on land. That's
exactly it. Yeah, that's a really cool analogy. This photo is from John Peters' collection. He's in the 1st Cavalry Division. They're up on the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And he recalled afterward the fact that why the heck, he doesn't say heck, but why the heck would anyone want to fight over this terrain, over this ground? Because he's at this point in January, right when the air war begins, they've already been at the border, and they're going to be there until the ground war launches 5 weeks later. So he's spent well over a month just sitting in the desert without resupply, without relief, staring off into this abyss, across the sea of sand. So that's an excellent analogy to keep that in mind. So in terms of the air war, when it launches, what is the strategic understanding? What's the thought process behind this air war?
The air war is carefully crafted, and it's an essential prelude to the ground war. Norman Schwarzkopf, who's the commander of the overall coalition forces, he later said in his memoirs, he said there was no question in his mind that the coalition was going to win. The question was, what was it going to take? And more importantly, how much was it going to cost in terms of lives? And through the knowledge of the Iran-Iraq war, through various intelligence sources, they have some understanding of Iraqi doctrine. And some of it is a borrowed Soviet doctrine, because the Iraqis have bought a lot of their armaments, not all, but they have bought a lot of their armaments from the Soviet Union. So they have some understanding of what's going on based on past performances. And one of the things that they know is, A, it's a very highly centralized command and control structure. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's not a lot of initiative at the lower levels. So in other words, this is an octopus that if you cut the head off, the tentacles, most tentacles are going to go limp fairly quickly. There are exceptions, particularly the Republican Guard and the three divisions, Hammurabi, Tawakalna, and Medina, that are in Kuwait. They're considered to be the best of the Iraqi forces, and there's good reason to believe that. So that's the first thing you want to do, is you want to take out command and control. You want to dominate the skies over Iraq, because once you do that, then you can start targeting the army with impunity and begin to reduce the heavily fortified positions that they've taken along the Kuwait border. You can see from this deployment here, they have basically taken up and fortified along the Kuwait border and a little bit into southern Iraq, and basically created a perimeter defense and deployed the rest of their mobile reserves in the rear, kind of taking a passive defense position, dug in, very much like World War I. They're basically preparing to fight the last war against the Iranians. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is, if you can attrit significant forces in this, significant parts of this force, either reducing their combat power, reducing their command and control, you can reduce the ability of the Iraqi army to respond quickly. The other reason you want to dominate the skies over Kuwait is because you don't want the Iraqis. The only way that the Iraqis can really see into Saudi Arabia is over the air, because of the coverage and the patrols we have along the Saudi border with Kuwait and Iraq. The only way is to fly. But if you shoot the Iraqi Air Force out of the sky, which the planes we don't shoot out of the sky end up running for their lives and sheltering in Iran for the rest of the war, which basically give us air supremacy over Iraq by the end of January. At that point, that's an effective screen for getting the forces out. And the other thing we should always remember is, during the air campaign, the ground forces are not in position yet. There are significant forces in southern Saudi Arabia opposite Kuwait, but the main forces that we think of when we think of that left hook that will be launched and will be the main strike forces of the 18th Airborne Corps, U.S. 7th Corps, supported by the British and the French. A lot of those troops don't actually get into theater. Actually, the other map, if you don't mind, this is the direct attack by the a lot of these troops that we're talking about that deploy from Europe or deploy from elsewhere don't actually get in theater until mid-January, when the air campaign is either just starting or has just started. So there's this major move. You got to move them several hundred miles. It's real easy to detect if you don't have air supremacy. And so those three objectives, it's a long-winded way of saying those three objectives are the reason that the air campaign is prosecuted for the length and with the target packages that it is prosecuted. And it works. It works very, very well.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I want to point out, let's see here, in this map, that region that we talked about being very desolate, being very difficult to maneuver without the technology to do so, is over here on the left. This is that riverbed. That's not always a river. It's only during some of the months. But it's really kind of like the last, if you will, really navigable terrain feature between here and far to the west. So it's assumed that, at least on the Iraqi side, that any successful ground assault has to come through between this riverbed and the coast. And so that's why it's expected that this is where you're going to see most of the fighting happening. And so you have that, you're right, you have that defense in depth, where you have that static line of all these infantry divisions, and then you have your mobile reserve in the back. Not all that dissimilar from any tactic, really, especially that you saw in any static defense, like even with Normandy in World War II, where you've got that initial line and the mobile reserve in the rear. And then
So I was searching for an analogy to think about that defense, and that's the best one, is the Germans in France, where you've got a screen of infantry up front, and then your mobile reserves, counterattack reserves, in this case, mechanized and tank divisions of the Republican Guard and some other elements in back there as a counterattack force.
And that image that I had up here, this one, this was originally the proposed concept, as you can see here, initial concept of operations from October of 1990, and the coalition line following that exact same expected assault, where here's that riverbed, and everything's happening between that border of the riverbed, which is the border between Kuwait and Iraq, and the coast, and it's a direct frontal assault. And this actually becomes part of the ruse, if you will, that they use, that the coalition forces use to have them stack up just on this side of the border to make it seem like this is exactly what they're going to do. And you're right. As soon as the air war begins and they remove the eyes of the Iraqi forces by taking out the Air Force, by taking out any sort of long-range detection, that's when they start moving the newly brought in troops during November and December, which are staging back down here further south in Saudi Arabia. And that's when they do what they call that Hail Mary play, where all the receivers go to one side of the field and they line up along this border here, which I'll show you in the next map.
One of the things I want to point out as you're calling up that map is, the Iraqi Army. Imagine you're a young Iraqi soldier. You're probably conscripted. You're probably in the middle of this godforsaken desert void, essentially, I wouldn't say against your will, but you're not real happy about being there. There's some question how much buy-in most of the Iraqis had at this point. There was significant war weariness because this country had basically been at war for 8.5 of the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
There's that. Your officers treat you badly. You're not very well fed. And I learned this in World War II, looking from accounts from different armies, and it's held true in other eras as well. One of the most demoralizing things for an infantryman, particularly a conscript, is looking up in the sky and seeing the other side's planes operating with complete and utter impunity and bombing you and shelling you. And you add the breakdown of command and control. You don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. By the time the ground war starts, you can imagine where most of these soldiers are mentally.
Oh, yeah.
Before we get into the ground war on the 24th of February, the main part of the ground war on the 24th of February.
Yeah. And here are those staging areas we were talking about. Here's that border line right there. There's the border between Kuwait and Iraq. And so this is really the extent of the Iraqi line up to about here, roughly. I can show you another map that shows that about mid-February, they've put some more infantry divisions out here because, of course, throughout this time, they're also bringing more units to the region to the point where they're trying to, one side is trying to bring in enough so that you have the ratio on your side.
Saddam's going to fight the mother of all battles, as he calls it.
Yep.
The thing is that the Iraqis, it's the same things that other armies have sometimes done, is they judge the enemy based on their capabilities. Yep. In other words, they judge the enemy based on what I can do is what I expect the enemy to do. Yep. And one of the things the Iraqis did not have a very good logistical ability to sustain large numbers of troops west in that sandy void that we pointed out earlier in southeastern Iraq. And so you'll notice there's a lot of infantry. There's not a lot of armor out there, which requires more of a logistics tale. At the same time, we're moving 500,000 forces, 500,000 troops, tanks, trucks, equipment, everything. Yep. We're executing this move at the same time.
Yeah.
And so that's going to catch the Iraqis off guard as well.
So if you look here with Rafsha, I probably butchered that, but Rafsha is over here. And it's completely, you've got this void in mid-February of Iraqi units. And of course, these are, again, conscript infantry divisions. So they're spread out really far apart. They're essentially a picket line, if you will. And you can see that we move the entire airborne corps about between mid-January, so the beginning of the air war, and mid-February, moves all the way to that left flank, that far left flank that's completely exposed. And you have the Iraqi line ending roughly about here underneath the eye in Iraq. 7th Corps, of course, stages right here in front of them. And then you've got, of course, the other forces, including the local regional forces, the Saudi Arabian forces, other coalition allies, and including the Marines lined up right here, which takes us to this. Here you can see them all lined up in the forces. You've got the left the Airborne Corps, the 18th Airborne Corps. 7th Corps is here in the center. This is going to be your heavy armor. This is really the brunt of the fist of that left hook, if you will, meant to sweep around and engage that venerated, I guess, if you could call it, or at least foreboding Republican Guard force, which is going to be the majority of the Iraqi army, or I'm sorry, armor, which is stationed up here. And then, of course, you've got the joint forces north and joint forces east. And then, of course, the Marines in the middle.
Yeah, we should point out as well that there's a significant decoy force of Marines offshore that have been practicing for landing to keep the Iraqis' focus attention to east.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good story.
And the Navy, including the USS Wisconsin, have been shelling Kuwait and have been shelling the Iraqi army. And the Iraqis, in their intelligence or in their interrogation reports, later said they hated the shells of the 16-inch guns because, unlike the planes where you could hear them coming, you knew a shell was on you when it blew up. So it really freaked them out.
This is one of my favorite photos. This is actually during the Battle of Khafji, which we can talk about here briefly. But we talk about that offshore shelling and the fact that, you kind of picture in your, at least I picture in my head, oh, it's way off, over the horizon, you're hardly seeing it or whatever. But this is how close the Missouri got to the shoreline to assist with that offshore shelling during the Battle of Khafji.
Yeah, it's, you could get in close. You could get in far away. I would think 20 miles was the effective range for those 16-inch guns. And sometimes they'd fire from that far out. Of course, they had Tomahawks. They had the cruise missiles. I mean, they were significant gun platforms that could bring a lot of firepower to bear on the Iraqis.
Yeah.
That's a really cool picture. That's just a really cool picture.
I want to show you another cool one. And we won't have time to get into the story in detail on this one, but this is from Jeffrey Kuhnjohn's collection. And we had talked about it briefly before the program. But you might recognize what he's standing in front of. This happens to be the arches to the entry to the city of Khafji, Saudi Arabia. And there's another one. You can see nice, it's beautiful, pristine, but notice how it's completely empty, that there's no one on the streets. There's nothing there. And then if we go, I think it's if I time this right. Oh.
And for those of you scoring at home, this is 5 miles inside Saudi Arabia from the southeastern corner of Kuwait, right along the coast. And in the end part of January, the Iraqis had sent a reinforced mechanized armored infantry brigade down there to engage, and basically were there for a couple days. And between the Marines, but especially the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, they got, well, you can see the aftermath of the battle. They got kicked out and sent back scurrying with their tails between their legs. So you saw the before picture. Yep. This is the after picture after 2 days of fighting in the town of Khafji.
So this photo is 2 days later from when that first photo was taken, because Jeffrey Kuhnjohn, who's with the 826 Ordnance Company out of Madison, they had just been driving around trying to find some supplies, and they ran out of gas the day before, actually the day of the attack happens overnight. They run out of gas just outside Khafji and have decided they might end up having to stay the night in Khafji. There's nothing going on. It's fine. And they end up coming across a Saudi Arabian army checkpoint, and they're able to barter for some gas. So they decided to keep going at least a little bit south, just to try and get back to the supply depot. And they decided, though, as they went through Khafji, they'd stop and take a couple pictures. And just so happens that then, of course, that night, within hours of those photos that I showed you originally. So within hours of that photo is the Battle of Kafchi. Just by happenstance, using the, they just were there within a few minutes kind of thing.
So the ground war starts. Let's get to the ground war with one eye on the clock, because I do want to leave some time for questions.
Yes.
The ground war starts on the 24th of February is when it really gets underway, and let's put it this way: for those of you who have studied the history of the Army, and I'm going to go on a slight sandbox moment. I'm going to preach for a moment. The Army after Vietnam adopted a doctrine called air-land battle. And the whole idea was really, for one of the few times in American military history, the Army needed to be ready to fight tonight, as they say in Korea. We need to be able to fight first shot and have a reasonable expectation of winning. We can't necessarily count on a long buildup like we had in World War I, World War II, Korea, so on and so forth. And so they developed this doctrine, and they've developed the weapons, the Abrams tank, the Apache helicopter, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Patriot missiles, which is a whole saga in and of itself, Kevin, we may be able to get into, if not possibly in a Q&A. And the vindication of that concept and the Army that the leaders of Vietnam built on the lessons of what they needed to do, this Army that was supposed to fight and win in Europe ended up just validating for my money, fully validated what they did, building the Army up, the Army of the 1980s. And you can see here's one of the Bradleys, and it looks like a Black Hawk helicopter. But this is if mobile warfare this is the American Blitzkrieg, is the 100-hour warfare, 100-hour ground war.
You think about the fact that this is also the premier equipment, because all the equipment that was developed and being developed was meant to fight in Germany. And so it was shipped to Germany. That's where all the active duty units were mostly stationed, to fight that Cold War, potential World War III. So when they start, finally, I think it's November, the brand new Bradleys are shipped from Germany to Saudi Arabia, and they replenish, like Peters's unit, the 1st Cav Division, they turn in their old Bradleys and get the brand new ones. They're meant to be state of the art. Whereas the Iraq Army is actually dealing with these export versions of the Soviet tanks from the last decade and a half. It's that technology that's going to make a difference too.
It's the technology, but the other thing I'll point out to you is, and this is something you and I have talked about when we were preparing for this talk, you can have all the technology in the world. You can have the best technology in the world. But at the end of the day, if you don't have good training, good leadership, and good communication, coordination, and collaboration, you're not going to get it done.
Yep.
And one of the best examples is, one of the most famous examples from this war is during the latter part of the ground war, when the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, just a relatively 1/3 of an armored division, runs into part of the Republican Guard, and in about a 20-minute fight destroys a significant part of one of the Republican Guard divisions. A feat that is then replicated on larger scales. In fact, some of the largest tank fighting in military history overall occurs up in northern Kuwait toward the end of the 100 hours. A lot of that is due to American discipline and British, because the British 1st Armored was also there. Yep. It's Allied discipline, it's Allied training. They use the technology. They have the technology superiority, but they also know how to use it. They've been trained on how to use it, and they're extremely well led and extremely capable. And that is something that, if you were to reverse the leadership on either side, the war's outcome may have been very different than what it was. Right. So also, longest, you see up there to the left with the landing zone Cobra, longest aerial assault in the history, air assault by helicopter, that is. Yep. As opposed to the airborne operations that we're more familiar with from the World Wars, for example. Largest helicopter assault in the history of the world, 155 miles inside of Iraq. And when they land there, the Iraqis don't really know they're there. They learn the hard way. And from there, it's 150 miles to Baghdad if they want to go there. And there's nothing between the 101st and Baghdad.
Yeah. And they use, I think it's over 150 Blackhawks to do this airlift all in one. I would love to see a photo, because there must be at some point between this operation and of course the next one that happens the next day to cut off the highway, of all these Blackhawks in the sky, because there must be somewhere. Somebody had to snap a photo, but it must have been the most terribly impressive just to see that.
Absolutely. And, we shouldn't overlook the role of the 101st and the French over there on the left flank.
Right.
Because the whole point of this is to go northeast and then turn east. And you need to make sure that basically when you turn east into Kuwait, you're turning the back of your army to the rest of Iraq. And this is the fourth largest army in the world that you're fighting. Mm-hmm. Not all of it is in Kuwait.
Right.
So we should never ever forget that these guys are out there performing very valuable service, securing the flank, as you can see, particularly the French and the French Foreign Legion. This is one of the great campaigns in the history of the French Foreign Legion out there.
Right. So this is essentially we're just going to abbreviate through the story of the ground war. I knew we should have done like multiples of these conversations just for Persian Gulf. But you can see just in the evolution of so let's start with day one here, the 24th. You've got that left flank that's going up to secure not only the rear of the only real main thoroughfare for any supplies going into the Republican Guard and Iraqi forces, but also to secure that flank, like you mentioned. You can see here that the 1st Cav, John Peters' unit, is doing that feint straight up into the dried riverbed region, and you've got a few other armored units in place. In fact, the 7th Corps wasn't supposed to advance on the 24th. They were supposed to advance on the 25th, but because the Marines and the other units on the south side of Kuwait are doing so well in advancing across those initial breaches, that the feint actually is causing the Marines' flank to be exposed to the Iraqi units that are still dug in along this part. And frankly, you've got an opportunity, so you've got to capitalize on it. So they move the assault up 15 hours ahead of time. And John Morgan, who's one of the stories that we have in our collection, talks about how he was in the right place at the right time. He got back to the departures, or the line of departure at the time he was supposed to be there, but his unit wasn't there because they had already left. The timetable had messed up some of the logistics of it. He had gone back to pick up a Humvee, and he has to now try and catch up. He spends 2 days, he says, driving through Iraq, trying to find his unit because they had moved up the timetable on him, even though he was where he was supposed to be when he was there. Now we move into the second day here by the 25th. You've got those armored units, the 1st and the 3rd, moving deeper and ready to engage the Republican Guard that's again up here on this flank. You've got the Airborne Corps up here again, securing cutting off essentially the main route, the main artery for the retreating forces, and also securing the flank. And now you've got more advancing straight into Kuwait City. We go into the 27th, if I can get the computer to cooperate. Actually, yeah, we go to the 26th, 25th. Here's the 26th. Now this is the day that really those initial Republican Guard units are engaged in reality. You've got the majority of the Iraqi forces are starting now to also retreat out of Kuwait, this one main artery out of Kuwait. And that's where you see that highway of death photos, which we won't show pictures of in this. You can find them online. But that's that one roadway all the way out. And part of this, using these roadways for American armor, you have this brand new technology, the GPS. So you can actually locate units and locate the geographical, what's the thing, longitude, latitude lines via satellite. So now we have things like the Battle of 73 Eastings, which is just it's a spot on the map. It's not even really a landmark. Yeah. Because that's how they're tracking their advance. Advance to this easting and hold until the rest come up. Advance to this easting and hold. Well, one of the other big things is that the Iraqis have dug in their tanks for a positional defense. Mm-hmm. Most of them are facing south because they're expecting to face the Marines and the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Kuwaitis coming north. And so we hit them in the flank and catch them off guard.
The other thing is one of the problems that they have is that the Soviet tanks, you have to stop to fire.
Yep.
You can't load and fire on the move like the British and the American tanks can. In fact, they have the stabilizer, so the tank can be bouncing all over the place. But whatever the gunner's pointing at, the barrel does not move. It moves with it stays fixed on that point. And a lot of times, part of it too is range and rangefinder with the thermals, particularly with the smoke, because Saddam has set off, of course, famously the oil wells. So you got a lot of smoke on a lot of these battlefields. The Iraqis don't have the thermals that we do. And we can, sometimes some of these tank commanders would say later, first time we knew the Americans were on us was when we took incoming.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's, again, it's one thing to have the technology. It's not all the technology. The Americans and the British in 7th Corps knew how to use their tools to best effect, and they used them to best effect.
Yep. And this is essentially the last real situation map on the 27th of February. You can see that over the course of those 4 days, the progress that the units made in closing in. I like using this as a flip book. If you bring up all those maps, this is how you start, and then you can see just the units closing in and trying to cut off that line of retreat. So what I want to do, if we have time here, I know we're knocking on the door of Q&A, but I want to just go through a couple photos from our collection, just to kind of talk about some of those personal stories that we have in the collection. So if you bear with me, I'm not actually going to do a full enlargement because that's taking far too long to try and work through. So we're just going to go through a slideshow of the previews here. I want to point this photo out. This is from Jeffrey Kuhnjohn's collection, 826, like I mentioned, out of Madison. They called this the Badger Pit. This was their CP post. You can see the Wisconsin flag flying there. They also have apparently a pet camel made out of sandbags that they had just outside the doors. You can see some of the emplacements, part of that building up the forces. Here you've also got those emplacements along the border with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. You can see this is the Bradley of one of the cavalry troops of 1st Cav Division. This is actually John Peters's troop here dug in. And this is really what all you have for your defense is your hull down, your turrets exposed. And this was his life. This is what he saw daily, day in and day out for about 6 weeks before the ground war really even started. As we move into the air campaign, I just want to point out one of the things, one of John Shear, who's on the USS Ranger, talks about how they really understood that the air campaign was picking up and what it actually meant, because on top of that, they were announcing targets. It was no longer just training missions. They were announcing where their targets were going. And actually, everyone would come up on deck. They were on the night crew, would come up on deck and write messages on the bombs, like, "Here's to you, Saddam," and things like that. So this photo actually comes from Jeffrey Kuhnjohn's collection as well. And you can see it's a dud, if you will, that is inert in the ground. And there's one of those messages. Do you have this feeling that this just isn't going to be your day? It's one of the messages that one of the crew members wrote on that ordnance. Also, again, it's the wettest winter for the desert. I love this photo from John Peters. You can see that the commander actually only lowered the Bradley ramp a little bit, not all the way to the ground, so that they didn't have to step off into the water. They could just get some fresh air while they're in their emplacement without being in the puddle or in the pool, if you will. And then, of course, the reality that every night it would be moisture, and so all your gear is strapped to the outside of the Bradley vehicle. And what do you have to do? You got to dry it out, otherwise it's going to get covered in mildew and mold. As we talked a little bit about those emplacements, you're dug in, they're facing south. Some of the defenses that they had to breach in that initial assault, especially, these oil pits that they were meant to be lit to help or to confuse coalition forces with the thermal sites. This pit in particular didn't actually get lit. There were some that did, but really it's very World War I. You can see those lines of barbed wire. You can see the trenches and the trench systems that were part of those initial emplacements. Obviously, one of the biggest worries and fears is going to be mines, the extensive minefields. And so you've got that to worry about as well. I put this photo in here with John Peters because he actually takes a book straight out of World War II. He tells us that his troop took sandbags and put it across his vehicle's hood, the front of the vehicle, like they did in World War II. And then actually they had their driver sitting on a couple bags of sand in case there were mines that they had to be worried about. As part of that advance, you're also dealing with weather. Sandstorms are a huge problem, but it's a whole different element. And of course, the reality comes down to you're also dealing with what's your view of the war. You're dealing with the reality that not everyone gets to look out a cupola. Not everyone gets to look out of the turret. John Peters says, the worst part of his service was just the sheer amount of hours that they had to ride in the back of the Bradley vehicle, not having any idea where they were. And you can imagine, he said he dealt with it pretty well, decently at least, because he was only 5'7". Anything above 5'10" in a Bradley, and you're in hurting by the time you're done being able to stop and stretch your legs a little bit. Bring this up too because Peters also talks about the fact that it's that go, and they're only stopping to refuel and rearm. And so finally, when the ceasefire is announced, they're actually able to sleep a little bit, because otherwise you're right in the back of the Bradley. And these are just taken just a little bit after the ceasefire goes into effect. They're notified of the ceasefire. And so finally they're able to stretch out on the ground and sleep. But he actually tells us that unfortunately their driver decided to park right next to the mortar platoon. And of course, there's still indirect fire going on even after the ceasefire takes place. So even though they're at least able to sleep a little bit, all of a sudden the mortars start going off and they're having to deal with that. But one thing he was sure to have was a Wisconsin flag. And that Wisconsin flag he had asked for his mother to send him so that he can actually we can actually figure out where his vehicle is. You can see here that it marks where his vehicle was in line, but he also wanted to make sure that he not only planted it on Saudi soil, but also Iraqi soil. So this is him driving the stake in and displaying that flag right after the ceasefire takes effect. We've actually got that flag in the collection at the museum. And I think that we can go over the rest. I just want to show this picture because this one's my favorite. I love that picture. It's a beautiful picture. You can see the sunset. Tactically, probably not a terribly great idea to put the Bradley right there, but what are you going to do in the desert? But it's a beautiful photo. And I do want, like I said, I did want to leave a little time still, obviously, for some questions, but that's my slideshow, Chris.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Eric, do we have any questions yet?
No questions have come through the chat board.
Well, since the audience is bashful, if you don't mind, I just wanted to talk about your experiences here for a second.
I tell you, sitting there watching Kevin's flip book, as he called it, of the movements by the days. That was really interesting to see. I hadn't seen anything put together like that. And it's just watching where 3rd Armored Division, started and where we moved to throughout the 100 hours was really interesting to see. I did have the fortunate luck of not being stuck in a Bradley hellhole. I was in a M1A1 loader's position, so I did get to stick my head out of the turret and look around. But I was a young private right out of basic training, literally. And I really didn't know what I was looking at the time. They didn't tell us, oh, we're going to, they didn't lay out the order of battle for us, at least not for the privates. So I hate to admit it, but I feel kind of lost as I'm watching Kevin go through all this. This is all kind of, I don't want to say new to me, but kind of new to me.
Well, that's not unheard of. I mean, a lot of the oral histories they talk about, you can't distinguish day 1 from day 2 from day 3. It kind of blurs together. In reality, 1, it's so fast, it's so quick, you're always moving. But 2, it's the exhaustion, it's the tension that you're always feeling as well. It's that emotional toll. And also three, you know, your reality is, you know, my view of the Persian Gulf War is whatever your job was. For those that were behind the lines, it's a completely different story. For those that even within like your vehicle, you know, your commander's, I'm sure, view of the war was different than yours, or perhaps in the Bradley, it's even worse, like you said, because you're literally just staring. You know, Peter's always talked about how the smell. You know, you've got 6 guys in this tiny little vehicle that haven't showered in 2 months, and their clothes are stiff with the oils and everything. But he couldn't remember what was happening on, you know, G day or G+1 or G+2. He couldn't distinguish necessarily because it just wasn't part of the mentality, and that's kind of blurs together at the end.
What you think of the Iraqis? What did they tell you about the Iraqis? Or what impression did you have, or did you not necessarily inform one?
No, we were definitely under the impression that they were not going to be anything for us to worry about. You know, we hit the ground, if I'm not mistaken, January 3rd, waiting for our tanks to come in via ship. We spent, you know, all that time waiting for our tanks to come in every single day, all day long, training for any eventuality that we would face out there. So by the time we actually kicked off, I mean, I can't speak for everybody else, but I'm pretty sure that they had similar sentiments. We felt we were supermen out there. We knew that there was nothing that was going to touch us. We were so confident in our training and our leadership and our vehicles. I really remember having absolutely zero fear, you know, going into war, so to speak. So yeah, we were definitely ready for whatever the Iraqis were going to throw at us. And I was talking with Kevin earlier, you know, after 100 hours and they tell us to stop, you know, it was a little irritating because we'd had seen some action, but we were really ready to just destroy everything and march on Baghdad and take everything over. That's what they had been telling us we were going to do. And then after 100 hours, they tell us to stop. We weren't very happy. You know, because we had been training, we're ready to go. We're just totally pumped, and we wanted more than 3 days worth of action.
Well, and forgive me, but the main action really, when you know, the Republican Guard isn't engaged until the 26th. They don't make contact really with the Republican Guard until the 26th. So there's really only like 36 hours of fighting with the Republican Guard, which is what one of the main targets of the 1st Armored and 3rd Armored was the idea to knock out the Republican Guard, to remove the ability essentially of Saddam's Iraq to wage war in the area again.
Yeah, and then we had a couple opportunities, you know, to really engage them in large numbers. I do remember one somewhat kind of engagement in particular. We were cresting this large hill going into a valley. We saw that this valley was just full of armored vehicles. And speaking of the armored vehicles, Kevin, you were talking about them being dug in.
Yeah.
You showed a couple of them. I was looking to see if those tanks had tracks on them. The ones that you showed did. I can't tell you how many tanks did not have tracks on them. Those tanks were dug in and they were not going anywhere.
That's a detail I've never heard in any of the histories of the war.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, they whether they deliberately took the tracks off or they just didn't have the material to keep them shredded, I don't know. But yeah, I can't tell you how many tanks we came across that had no tracks on them whatsoever. You were a pillbox. But the one engagement that I do remember in particular, we come up over this hill, and you know, there had to be a few hundred vehicles out there. They stopped us, they backed us off onto the backside of this hill, and they called in all the A-10s. And they had the A-10s mop up this valley for us before we actually had to go through. That was a little disappointing as well, because here we are ready to start pulling triggers, and you know, they you know, calling the A-10s to do all of our work for us. It was nice to see the A-10s, and it was really an interesting sight, you know, to see 15, 20 of these things just swooping through this valley and not leaving anything alive. But at the same time, you know, they kind of stole our thunder a little bit. But, you know, other than that, I think we've shot maybe 6 or 7 main gun rounds. I think we took out a total, my tank took out a total of 4 or 5 tanks, if I'm not mistaken. My gunner did get to engage some infantry, very little, but he did get to engage some infantry with his coaxial 240. But yeah, it's just, you're right. You say 100 hours, you really shorten it down to maybe like 36 hours. And I don't want to say it was disappointing, but we were really pumped. We were really ready for more.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that, Eric. I really, really appreciate that.
Hey, Chris, you know, I wrote about it in my Bugle article as well about my time over there. I really look on this period of my life as one of the best 6 months of my life for many reasons. But to be able to have that kind of experience, that's not something that everybody gets. And I think it's really, I don't want to say rewarding, but it certainly is eye-opening, and it makes you evolve as a person, for sure.
It's amazing how many veterans throughout the generations say something along the same lines of how important their military service is to the rest of their lives. So that that makes perfect sense to me.
Indeed.
I understand we do have a couple questions coming in through chat.
Sure.
Take a look real quick. First question that came through, were the U.S. forces well prepared for desert warfare? I think I just kind of touched on that, but I'll let Kevin and Chris talk about that as well. And a kind of a follow-up on that, so we Brits had to do a lot of hurried modifications with regards to dust filters on tank engines and track repairs and things like that. This question is from
Neil Carey, it looks like.
Neil, I can talk a bit about that as far as the dust issue.
I think Eric's internet has hiccuped at the wrong time. I'll pick up a little bit and hopefully he can come back and finish. A lot of our equipment had been designed and had been manufactured for use in Germany or in Europe. And so in terms of dust modifications and dust filters and things like that, I remember my mother actually, her school adopted a marine rotor heavy lift, VMF 454. It was one of those heavy lift squadrons. And the guy wrote back and talked about what sand did to the blades and how it would, eat away at the edge of the blades, and the filters that they needed to put on the engines and changing the oil and all that stuff. So there were modifications that needed to be made, just like you'd find in, going from theater to theater. Eric, you tapped out there for a second because of your internet connection. So, but I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, not really. I remember the tanks having a great dust filtration system. We called them V-packs. There was 3 of them. The only bad thing about that was that you had to pull them out pretty consistently and clean them out with we called it a wand, which is a big, blower hose type of thing. But you had to have 2 tanks to do it. One tank had to provide the power to blow the V-packs out of another tank. And then, you had to switch and reverse. So then you put your V-packs back in, hook your wand up, and the other tank takes care of theirs. But aside from doing that, we really didn't have any problems with, any modifications. Those tanks were ready to go in desert environments. I know that they were pretty much planned that way in their design process, and I think they worked really well.
Excellent.
Got another question here. If I'm still online, I think I am.
Yes.
What were the official totals of U.S. and Allied casualties for Operation Desert Storm? If you guys have those numbers in front of you.
Yeah, I actually do. If I can pull up my notes. So for the Persian Gulf, for the U.S. forces, killed in action is 143, died of wounds is 4. There's a whole bunch of different other statistics breakdowns that I can go into if you're interested at some point. That's just killed in action. That doesn't necessarily cover those that actually there were other incidences, such as those that died in accidents or other situations, which were actually quite prevalent. for world, I don't actually have that number off the top of my head, but I thought it was a couple hundred.
It was less than 1,000 overall for the entire coalition. I was looking at this earlier. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but if you factor in accidental deaths and you factor in deaths among the coalition, not counting the 200 some odd Israelis that were killed by Scuds or the result of Scud attacks as well, it's less than 1,000 dead on the Allied side. The Iraqi side, it's difficult to tabulate. The easiest number to tabulate is prisoners, which approached the number of approached 6 figures, depending on the estimates, whose estimates you use.
Yeah. For Wisconsin, yeah. We had 10 or 11. I think it's 11 officially that didn't come home.
Yeah, everybody in my units, we all came home. We had nobody wounded, nobody lost. Speaks to our training, but then I think it also speaks to the overall combined operations. And I also think it speaks to the Iraqi Army as well. They were scared. They were terrified. I remember we came up over a little crest of a hill, and my gunner started going nuts. He wanted to start machine gunning all these troops. A couple hundred Iraqi soldiers out there, until we noticed that they were actually waving white flags. They were surrendering. We had to kind of calm my gunner down because he was ready to go. And our tank appropriately was named War Crimes. He maybe almost committed some. This was before all the politically correct atmosphere that we're in nowadays.
Yeah, read a little differently in 1991, I'm sure.
A little bit. We flew a large Jolly Roger pirate flag on our antenna as well. So if you ever see any pictures of Desert Storm and there's a tank with a large pirate flag on the back, that's us. I'll
keep an eye out for it.
But yeah, the Iraqis were scared, and so I think it was a combination of all those factors that really led to not very many casualties or wounded. And Kevin was showing that photo of the guys all hunkered around the missile or the projectile there. That was a dud. I know that we heard a lot of stories about people who picked up projectiles and cluster bombs and things like that. And I understand that that's probably where we lost a lot more of our troops than we should have. Just people not being very smart.
Yeah. There were a couple of friendly fire incidences too. So I found it's 219. There were 212 men and 7 women that were the U.S. casualties. 154 of them killed in battle, like I mentioned. 65 died from non-battle causes. 35 of the battle deaths were a result of friendly fire.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I don't see any more questions coming through, and we are about 10 minutes past the hour. So I think this is where we say goodbye to everybody. But Kevin, I think you're right in one of your earlier comments that maybe this could have been portioned out into maybe a couple events, especially once you get me talking about it, because now I'm starting to reminisce and remember all these things that I hadn't thought about for a while.
Well, and there's so many stories in the collection, and we're always collecting more. We're looking for more. So I think it might be worth revisiting, maybe next year for the 31st anniversary, or maybe before that. But there's definitely a lot of other components to the story. We didn't even get into the 13th EVAC hospital, which was out of Madison. They were preparing for 5,000 casualties a day, and they were told to expect that. And there's a wealth of information, a wealth of Wisconsin stories. And I encourage you all, if you can, to explore our content and our stories on our website and join us through our social media. We share stories and quotes that way, and our blog. But most importantly, join us for future programming.
I would second that motion, Kevin. Absolutely. We'd love to see everybody come back for not only our Curator Conversations, but all the other virtual programs that we have going on. You can find all that on our website, wizvetsmuseum.com. Look under the events section, and we have all our events listed there. And like I said, we'd love to see everybody come back and join us for some of our other events that we have going on, such as trivia night, movie night, our drink and draw, events that we have. Getting more and more people showing up for our virtual events, and it's fantastic. We plan to continue these even after we reopen the museum and get back to whatever normal is going to look like. We still plan on giving these virtual events because it really just increases our reach and our audience. And just like you folks out there today, fantastic that you showed up. And we really thank you for joining us today for this event, for this conversation. And I would like to thank Chris Kolakowski, our director at the museum, as well as Kevin Hampton, our curator of history, for putting together. These two gentlemen are a wealth of knowledge. Like I said, I was in the actual event and I learned from these gentlemen all the time, stuff that I didn't even know was going on. So Chris, Kevin, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody in our audience. I hope you have a great rest of the day and we look forward to seeing you next time.